Sue, you're going to start that recording in a moment. Can I just remind everybody of the protocols around these virtual meetings? If we can all keep our cameras off and our microphones muted. And if we want to make a comment, if we use the hands up signal, which should be on your toolbar somewhere on your screen. If you are struggling with that, hands up, if you just make a note in the chat box or switch your camera on and wave at the camera, that might help attract our attention. We have to cater for everybody with every level of technical expertise. I am going to ask Sue to share on her screen the agenda and the notes, but we won't go through like an auto cue. But if people who are presenting want to draw our attention to a particular page or piece of information, if we can have that on screen so everybody can see it, for those who aren't multi-screening or don't have a paper copy. If that's okay, we will move on. So if we can have a look now at the minutes of the meeting held on the 11th of May, and we will go through those. First of all, we will check to see if they are an accurate representation. Does anybody have any comments on page 1? Page 2. We get an early years update as well. Page 3. And page 4. And page 5. And then the work plan on page 6. Could somebody recommend that they are a true record?
I'll do that, Adrian. John Wise.
Fantastic, thank you, John. And anybody like to second that? Please, can we just have another show?
Second, I will.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark. Much appreciated. Brilliant. So we'll take them as a true record. Do we have any matters arising from that? Anything coming out, if we go back up then to page 1, any matters arising from the early years working group update? Anything from the de-delegation? There is a comment on the de-delegation that we will be receiving the letter about de-delegation, Sue, at the start of the autumn term. Is that right?
Sorry, yes, that's right.
Thank you. Any further questions about that? No? Okay. Anything off item 7, the management plan? No. Anything off item 8? Off item 9? Item 10? Item 11, or the work plan. No, excellent. Okay, if we can then move on to agenda item 4, which is a report from the LACES and LAC pupil premium, and that's Trish. Trish, would you switch your mic on and your camera on, and then we'll all listen. Thank you.
Good evening, Adrian. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to read as I go along. I know Sue's got it up on the screen there, sharing, and as Adrian said, questions in the chat at the side, and I'll answer them when I get a second. So this is a report about Wirral's looked after children's education services known as LACES, or Wirral Virtual School. Since 1989, the authorities have had a duty to look after the education of children in care and to do their best to promote educational achievement of children in care. Since 2014, there was a requirement on local authorities to appoint a virtual head. That's me. There was lots of predecessors before me. I think I'm about fourth. They also recommended that colleagues consider the capacity around the virtual head to enable them to provide the service. In support of closing the educational attainment gap, government committed funding called Pupil Premium Plus to every looked after child. Initially, this was £1,900 a year. In 2018, it rose to £2,300, and recently it's gone up to £2,345. That's per pupil per annum. That funding comes to the virtual school. It doesn't go direct into school. It comes to the virtual school, whose remit it is to distribute that to schools in accordance with educational plans that are a statutory requirement to show how schools are using the money to close the educational attainment gap. Wirral Virtual School, also known as LACES, Looked After Children Education Services, is made up of what we call education progress officers. It's their responsibility to ensure that all the children in care have a personal education plan, which recognises the child's strengths and areas for development, and that every plan includes smart targets to enable the child to make accelerated progress through targeted use of funding. We do ask that progress is accelerated in order for the educational attainment gap to close. Historically, children in care do suffer delay educationally because of trauma and attachment issues at birth. If you scroll down a little bit, Sue, please, to a chart, we'll show you how the current LACES team is made up. This is the current team. There's a virtual head, which is me. I have an education lead whose responsibility is over secondary cohort. She's supported by Carolyn and Ruth within that secondary team. We have a primary team made up of Emma and Jane, and we have, quite new to the team, an education progress officer with particular remit to look after the early years cohort. Previously, Pupil Premium Plus was distributed to schools upon production of a PEP on a termly basis. A PEP came in and the money was allocated. The process has changed considerably over the past 2 years, and the EPOs on the team now provide much more support and challenge to schools regarding how they are using that money. We no longer have a termly PEP, we have an autumn term PEP and a summer term PEP, and in the spring term the team go out and visit schools, and as far as they can, they do that in person. If not, it's a virtual visit. But they'll talk to the schools about the impact of the Pupil Premium Plus and the progress the children are making. They'll support the schools to make the best use of the money. They'll also challenge them to consider the interventions it's providing, and if they're not having much impact, to stop them and try something else. That strategy is working, but we're changing it just slightly again to make the 2 terms either side of the spring term a mandatory meeting as well, so that schools and social workers all join up with LACES colleagues and make sure that everybody gets together around a table as well. Since 2018, LACES have top sliced some of this funding. Initially, it was £400 a child. When the money rose from £1,900 to £2,300, the additional £400 was retained by the virtual school. I took over partway through this year, and there was no plans actually to use that money at the time. So at the end of that financial year, it was distributed back to schools. But since then, we've got firm plans in place of how we utilise that money. And it's enabled us as a virtual school to strengthen the capacity in the team and to be able to support schools when children were in crisis or just needed that further support than they could provide with 2,300. Again, if we scroll down a little bit, so please. This table shows how we utilise that top slice. This is the money that comes in. There's 644 per 3. That's the amount, the number of children in care in Wirral. 395 is the element we top slice, which gives us just over £250,000 to spend. This is how it's allocated this year. £40,000 was a payment to Looked After Call. They gather all our attendance data and end of key stage assessment data as well. We've provided resources for teachers in every Wirral school, and it's cost us £20,000. Among that included an app for behaviour management strategies, an assessment tool, a book about attachment in the classroom, and 3 videos about return to school after lockdown. We do, on occasions, provide some of our children with alternative education provision when we find them out of school. This year, we've committed to £50,000. It's been spent on Utopia, Next Gen and Cornerstones. We do always need that. We've currently got some children out of borough who we need to source educational provision for as well. We liaise with the virtual schools if they're out of borough, wherever that authority is, and ask for recommendations there. We've included in this top slice capacity within the team. That's enabled us to source Sarah Dacey, and her additionality has really impacted on the team because she's got 24 years experience in the largest secondary school in Liverpool as assistant head. So it's really strengthened our team. The other thing we need on a regular basis is access to TAs and tuition. We've drawn a contract with Randstad education providers. We went out to soft tender and we went with Randstad because they provide a system called Opus, which shows us how our money is being used. And it also shows us the impact that it's had on the children. It's our first year with them, so hopefully by the end of this academic year, they'll provide that report for us and it'll be included in the head teacher's report. We're lucky enough to have 1 child in boarding school, and our contribution towards the cost of that is £10,000 a year. It's given her some really good opportunities. Then we've got a section of unallocated funds there, which bring our total to the top slice element. If we go down a little bit, so the impact of that top slicing on the service provided by LACES has been, we're up to currently stand at 98% completion of PEPs. I don't know the figures before, but I think in my head, somewhere it was around about 13%. 85% of our PEPs are good or better quality now. There's been some really immediate quality feedback to schools. We're now able to share the PEP on Teams and edit it directly with them to ensure that it is good quality and to ensure that it includes good details about how they're using funding to promote children's education. This year, there have been no looked after children permanently excluded from school. Every Wirral school has been visited by LACES and 80% of out-of-borough schools as well to develop relationships and to provide support and challenge to raise explanations and progress of looked after children. Based on the last data catch we've got, which is quite a long time ago now because of the pandemic, but Wirral Children in Care were making better progress generally than the overall cohort. We're going to drill down into that an awful lot more when we were able to do so, and we're looking at capacity within the team to bring on the services of a data management professional because of the new responsibilities on the virtual school for educational progress of children in need and child protection children and anybody who's had social worker involved in their life. We've worked with colleagues in data teams to produce reports showing the education progress of looked after children in GLD at key stage early years, phonics in years 1 and 2, key stages 1, 2 and 4 assessment data. We also gather termly data from the PEPs, and the reports that are produced on Power BI that I can't access just now because my password has just changed and it's kicked me out, but it shows that we're able to see at a glance how well we're doing. The rest of the money that's distributed to schools, the 644 times, the 1950 that goes to school times the number of children in care comes to 1,255,000. And the chart below shows how that's been distributed. But there's a big category there that I'm going to explain at the end of this presentation. But gathering information from the PEPs, our schools are generally using the money for TA support, for tuition, for therapeutic intervention, IT equipment, small group intervention, equipment and resources, school trips, extracurricular activities, before and after clubs, and SALT. But if you look, there's a big category at the top called Other. We needed that section because still on a lot of the PEPs, schools aren't itemising how they're using Pupil Premium Plus, and in some cases they're not requesting it. To enable us to show that, that category is other. So if they haven't requested the full amount of 1,950, the difference is put in that category. And if a school comes in and says they haven't requested it, that goes in there, which shows the request at the bottom of this report to have your support in going back to schools to ask for more information about how this funding is being used and the impact that it's having on the children's education. I think if we scroll down a little bit more, Sue, they're the recommendations there. So the recommendations with the forum notes, the report, and that the recommendation is the further information to be provided by schools as to how they're using Pupil Premium Plus funding, particularly in relation to the other category, and further investigation of the impact of spending of Pupil Premium Plus. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Trish. Much appreciate that. And thank you for setting out the context of your service as well. That's always useful for especially for people new to forum. So we all do note that report. Does anybody have any questions? John?
Yeah, just briefly. It's a question for everybody really that's connected with the school. Why do we not show the spending of Pupil Premium Plus in your Pupil Premium report? Is it simply because it's not a statutory requirement, or is it because it's not taken on by all schools?
It's improving with all schools, and we do. This report is taken from my head teacher's report, which will be a public document. It's not been made public so far because I've not had the capacity to do it, but James is here and he'll tell you that it is in our plans to have a website which includes this, but it should be published information. The schools are improving in how they cost out the use of Pupil Premium Plus. But I think, John, the issue for me has been historically it wasn't questioned. So we've had to have a bit of a change of culture. You're getting this money, but we need to be able to show how it's being used. And it's been a little while in the process getting there, but I think colleagues in schools will say that there has been a lot of progress made. We're not there yet, hence the report request to have your support in going forward with that. But we are able to gather the information, and each year we look at the categories that we gather, because each year we'll have something else that comes up. So improvements are made every year during the summer when we're allowed to be a little bit more strategic because schools are shut.
Okay, thanks, Trish.
Is that okay, John? Yeah. Okay, Mrs. Morris from Eastway.
Hi, Trish, it's Emily.
Hi, Emily.
Hi. Just want to say that we've seen, obviously we've got 12 looked after children. We've seen a real difference in the service. So thank you so much for all the changes that we've seen in you and your team. Just had one quick question about the AFIT tool and the Reach to Teach training. Was that open to primaries and secondaries or just primaries?
No, primaries and secondaries. Every school on Wirral. Every school on Wirral should have had access to the 3 videos, to the book, which should have been delivered by now, to the AFIT tool and to the app. It's gone to, Emily, you are the designated teacher for looked after children in your school, so it should have come straight to you. If you need, Emily, if you haven't...
I've got it. It's just I've been speaking to secondary colleagues who weren't aware of it. I just wasn't sure whether it went out to primaries and secondaries.
No, every school on. Yeah.
Thank you, Trish.
Okay.
Thank you. Could you put your hand down, please, as well, so we can keep a record of it? I'm sorry to nag, but these things sometimes get in the way. Could I just check this? So that, do we have anybody from secondary who can recall seeing that AFIT tool? Just out of interest, on the back of that question. I
can't, Mark.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I don't recall seeing that personally. It's something.
I can get a list of all the schools that have accessed it so far. We had a designated teachers meeting in last term, in the spring term. And all the links to join that and access that were given out. In addition, the girls have all emailed every one of their schools, their designated teachers, with the links to access them as well. But what I can do, we have a list of all the schools that have accessed it. So following on from this, I'll get that list out to schools. And if you've not signed up, I do recommend that you do. The app I know has been particularly useful, and the AFIT tool, it's not compulsory to use it. And we know some schools have got an awful lot of looked after children. What we don't want at the current time is to burden you with a lot more to do, but it was recommended by one of our schools and by other virtual schools in the region. So if you've not accessed it, drop me a line, but I'll send the links out anyway to all schools.
Fantastic. Would it be all right if I shared that right round the secondary patch, just in case people missed it? Yeah. It has been a very busy year, hasn't it? Yeah. James.
Just very quickly, it's just to follow on the point that Trish made around the new statutory duties that have been brought in for the virtual school head teacher in relation to child protection and children in need and formally involved in social care. There is an additional grant as well that the DFE have been made available for all local authorities. We will come back to Schools Forum next year just to articulate how that grant will be used in the follow-up. Is that okay, Adrian?
That's great. Thanks, James. Brilliant. Any more questions for Trish? Trish, in other years when you've been underspent against that budget, that the remaining funds were distributed through a mechanism to schools that had children who are looked after. Does this report mean that your budget is now balanced and there is no carry forward?
We can't carry it forward, it's not allowed, and there's somebody present in this meeting that makes sure it's never carried forward. We can carry forward enough to pay any invoices that need to come in, but if it's not spent, it's clawed back by the government. And not only is that frowned upon, but it means our children aren't getting the support. So any underspend at the end of every year is distributed back to schools.
Forgive my clumsy wording, I didn't mean carried forward, I meant distributed before it was clawed back. But does the budget now balance so that all of those funds that come for those children are spent on those children?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so anybody got any more questions before we note the report? And I don't feel that anybody can argue with the recommendation for us to have further information on how we use that. I have got one question in the chat box there. Hold on just a second. Could you answer this one for us?
Yeah, of course I can.
How long do pupils retain their Pupil Premium Plus if they return to their parents?
If a child has been in care for one day in a financial year, they are entitled to Pupil Premium Plus. So in that financial year, they should be in receipt of 1,950. As soon as they go back to parents in the next financial year, that stops. If children go on to be adopted or on SGO, they continue with Pupil Premium Plus, but it doesn't come to the virtual school, it goes straight into school. But if they go back to parents, Pupil Premium Plus stops. But during the financial year that they were in care, they should be entitled to the full remit of 1,950.
Thank you. I hope, Roy, that answers your question. Excellent. In which case, we will undertake those following recommendations 1, 2 and 3. And thank you, Trish, for that report.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Trish. Okay, if we can move on then to agenda item 5, which is the early years update. And this isn't Carol, this is
Sarah Harper.
Sarah, there we go. Yes. Hi, Sarah.
Sorry,
so if you put your video on and we'll get to the right page. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, so I'm Sarah Harper from the Business Support and Performance Manager on behalf of Carol Fenlon. I'm going to assume that everyone's read the report, so I'll just highlight a couple of key points. The first being that we're planning on spending the early years underspend, and key to that will be a workforce development group, which we're in the process of setting up to support recruitment and retention. As we know, this is a big issue both nationally and locally across Wirral. We are looking at other funding streams that may be able to support this, because we see this as a 2-3 year project. The other key area would be the current pressure on the inclusive practice funding budget. We've had increased needs, so for the summer period we normally only have 2 panels with 1 meeting, possibly 2 in each panel. This year we've had our first panel has had 3 meetings, so 75 children plus. Our second panel is due to go ahead soon, and I know that we've got at least 13 applications with more coming through. So we're expecting that will be another busy panel. And then we always have more applications in the September and spring term as well. So we're expecting quite a number of applications given the need across the sector. Any questions?
Does anybody have any questions for Sarah? It is good to see that fund that's been difficult to spend is being used up, and I think we should applaud all the efforts you put into that, and all the efforts you put into what's been a horrific year for your sector. I think you've been put under an enormous amount of strain under the COVID closure and the way that you've been kept open and been funded over that time. So I think you deserve a lot of praise for that.
Thank you.
Anybody have any questions for Sarah before we move on? You've stunned us into silence. That's exactly how a report should be. Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Sarah.
Thank you.
Brilliant, everybody. Thank you. Let's move on. If we can scroll down, then we've got agenda item 6, which is the Falling Roles and Growth Fund, which I believe is Christine.
Yes, thank you, Chair. My name's Christine Thompson. I'm the Finance Business Partner supporting colleagues in schools and education service. In financial year 2021, Schools Forum agreed on a criteria for distributing the Falling Roles and Growth Fund. And for last year, that fund was £466,000. Reported at the May meeting that the Falling Roles and Growth Fund for 21-22 is only £153,000. And the reason for that reduction is that the Falling Roles and Growth Fund value is based on the headroom that's left in the schools block allocation after we have distributed to schools following the use of the national funding formula. What forum members were keen on May is that before we actually used our existing agreed criteria to distribute the fund, we would look at what the financial impact would be, and also Schools Forum asked officers to look at some other alternative bases on which we could distribute the fund. I'll just talk briefly about those different bases that we've looked at. So, Sue, could I just ask you to go to that appendix, Appendix A? And sorry for colleagues, it's quite small, this, because there is quite a lot of information on it. But what we did first of all is we looked at what the impact would be of allocating the fund based on our current criteria that's agreed. And that criteria is based on the allocation of the fund will be based on a 3-year pupil number changes. So that's not a percentage growth or fall, but the actual number of pupils that have either reduced because of falling roles or grown. And that's the total number over a 3-year period. And those numbers are based on the census information we collect each October. So on the basis of that existing criteria, if we look at option A, there are around 30 schools that would benefit. But that financial benefit, because of the size of the fund, means that in one particular case, the smallest allocation of funds would be as small as £583,000, which possibly isn't the most effective use of the fund. So we also...
Christine, you made a slight error there. You said £583,000. I think it's £583.
Sorry, £583. Apologies.
I know you think we're all loaded, but £583,000 would be significant.
Sorry, apologies for that, £583. We then looked at option B. Option B is a little bit of a hybrid of option A, in that we're still looking at that 3-year consistent growth or falling roles. But what we looked at was what the impact would be where a school's 3-year growth or falling roles represented a 10% or greater change. And what that resulted in was less schools actually benefiting, but those that did benefit would benefit from a larger value of funding, which would perhaps mean we could do something more effective with that funding within the schools. Another option that we looked at, option C, was looking at falling roles over a 3-year period, but the impact of growth just on a 1 year change, i.e. the change from October 20 census to October 21 census. And whilst that meant there were a lot more schools that would benefit, it meant the actual distribution was really quite small. So the lowest fund would be £191. But what also that doesn't give us is it doesn't recognise that 3 year-on-year change. And it is possible for some schools on the list potentially to have had a fairly steady period and just having a small change in a 1 year period. We then also looked at option D, which was applying the same criteria as option C, but we looked at what the impact would be if we offered we applied a minimum funding level to each school, and we picked a minimum funding level of £3,500. But the impact of that means that the fund for 21-22 would be overspent. We'd be needing to allocate almost £100,000 more than we actually have in the fund. And I think we felt that perhaps wasn't appropriate, given that we've opened the 21-22 position with a cumulative deficit in the DSG reserve, £1.7 million, and where we overspend the Falling Roles and Growth Fund, that overspend has to be accounted for in the wider DSG reserve. The final option we looked at, which was option E, was again looking at the 3 year falling roles, impact of falling roles over a 3 year period, and a 1 year change where there'd been growth in schools. But in order to try and give more meaningful financial rewards, we looked at where the 1 year growth was an impact of 5% or more for primary schools and 2.5% or more for secondary schools. And what this generated was a more meaningful fund for each of those schools that benefited. But again, it didn't take into account the impact of that continuing growth where schools have had growth over a 3 year period, but just focused on a 1 year change. Looking at those results, what the Wirral felt was the most appropriate option to apply would be option B. We felt that that was the most appropriate basis for allocation of the fund, as in it's consistent with the previous year's criteria, and Schools Forum did take a significant amount of time to come to a conclusion that that was an appropriate basis on which to apply the funds. But we also felt that it would give individual school allocations that would sort of support a more effective use of the fund overall. Just before I move on to the recommendations in paragraph 5, one thing that we just wanted to bring to Schools Forum attention is the way that we've looked at the different criteria for allocating the fund, and that includes the criteria that Schools Forum have already agreed and used in a prior year, very much focuses on it's a numerical calculation, just looking at that quantum of growth and falling roles. And what it doesn't take into account is those factors that drive changes. So, for example, when we're looking at growth in numbers, what we're not looking at is what's actually driving that growth and those external factors. And that means that what we're really focusing on is where, and not necessarily picking up on basic need all of the time looking at growth. And I think as a council, we felt that it was appropriate to look at what was driving that change overall. So what we're proposing for the September Schools Forum is to do a bit more of a development and come back with some proposals on maybe a different way of distributing the fund, and to try and capture those external factors such as demographic changes, and really to support and target the need where disadvantage to a schools is outside of its control. And I think one thing that we might like to try and do is to actually, before that report comes to the September Schools Forum meeting, is to actually give our different schools working groups such as WASH maybe the opportunity to see that report in early September before it gets to Schools Forum. Before I ask forum members if they have any questions or comments, if I can just look at paragraph 5, Sue, which is the recommendations. And what Wirral are recommending is that the Schools Forum adopt option B as a basis to distribute the fund for 21-22, and also that Forum notes those developments in section 4, and that we will be bringing a further report back to the September meeting. Happy now to take any comments or questions from Forum members.
Thanks, Christine. That was very clear. Has anybody got any questions around this for Christine? I would make an observation that option D is clearly not viable, and I think it would be unthinkable to set an overspending budget from this pot. I don't think there's any rationale in the world that would support that. But the others seem like that they've been worthwhile exercises, and it seems to make sense to use the budget in a way in schools where it'll actually make a difference. So let's have a look. Has anybody got any more questions for Christine before we go on to that? Okay, so then can this is adopt. The recommendation is that we adopt option B, which is the option that's illustrated in the Appendix A. If we haven't got any questions, Sue, just refresh my mind. Is this a vote required, or is this objections only?
I think this is a vote.
Okay, in that case, if anybody is happy to go with 5.1, if you can indicate if you are you agree, disagree, or abstain, if you can use the chat function for that. So if we can start off with agree. Those of you who would agree, if you would like to type in the box. Okay, and
11, 12.
Are we okay with that, Sue? And then if we can disagree, if anybody wants to type disagree into the message box, if you can do that now, please. And then abstain, if anybody wishes to abstain from that. Could you write that in? Okay, Sue, can we just check numbers that we've got those who are eligible to vote for that only counted in that, but that would appear to be without objection. And I think 5.2 is something that we all look forward to, the development plans where we are going to get some information through the primary, secondary and relevant sectors prior to the September meeting. I think that is an excellent idea. So thank you very much for that. Any more questions for Christine before we move on from this piece? Excellent. Thank you, Christine. So if we can then move on to item 7, which is the budget outturn, which I think is Sue. Is that right?
No, it's me again. It's Christine again, Chair.
You can never have enough of you, Christine. So carry on.
Okay, thank you. In this outturn report, I've opened just with a very small update on the financial year 2021, which ended 31st of March 21. When we reported to the May meeting, the Forum pointed out that whilst the Council's external audit process was underway, the final outturn position, which we reported an overspend of 414,000, was still provisional, and that's still the case because the audit has not yet been concluded. Also in that report, we reported the underspend on the early years of 290,000, which Sarah mentioned in her report, the plans that they had to spend that underspend. But at the May meeting, it was still provisional based on the final confirmation of the early years grant for 2021. And as yet, we still have not had confirmation yet from ESFA of the final grant. given that the next meeting of Schools Forum isn't till September, just want to propose that at the next meeting, propose that once I get confirmation of that early years grant and we can confirm what the final underspend position is, rather than wait till September, I'll notify members of that by email so we can get that final decision ratified and the early years team can move on with their plans. Just moving on to the 21-22 budget. At the end of May, early June, when we met with our officers within the council, we've identified at the moment that the forecast position at the moment for 21-22 is an overspend position of £1.1 million, which is mainly due to pressure in the high needs block. If you wouldn't mind just moving down, Sue, to the table in paragraph 3.1. So looking at that overspend position, schools block and schools dedelegated are a balanced position, a small underspend of £36,000 on the central block, £1 million forecast overspend on the high needs block, an overspend on the early years block, which isn't a true overspend, but I will come on to that when I look at the different blocks in detail, giving us the 1.1 million overspend. And the impact of that means that when we'd originally budgeted to make a contribution to the DSG reserve from the high needs block of £2,683,000, because it was identified when we set the budget that we would not need to use all of the high needs block. What that would have meant, we had a brought forward deficit position on the DSG, an overspend of 1.7 million. Had we made that positive contribution, we would have been left with a surplus on the DSG by the end of the year of £1 million. But because of that overspend position now, we're only looking to be able to make a contribution to DSG at the end of the year of 1.5 million, which means we'll have an overspend of around 200k, which means we're near as balanced. But what it doesn't give us is any reserves should we have any emergency positions. Just moving on to looking at a little bit more detail about those most noticeable variances for 21-22. If I can just ask Sue to go to the appendix 1, and just running through those most noticeable variances, we can see that on the schools budget on the special schools at the minute we're forecasting an underspend of almost £450,000. And the reason for that is that when we set the budget, we included in there additional places of an additional 40 places for our special schools. At the moment, we're working through some commissioning of additional placements of just 22 of those places, and they won't have a full year effect. So that underspend is based on the estimate that some of those places will be allocated only from September, and more of those places either won't get allocated during the year or will only be allocated from January, and that's generating at the minute that forecast underspend of £450,000. Just looking at the early years, the overspend of £176,000, that's actually an approved overspend. That represents the surplus on the Disability Access Fund that we brought forward from 2019-20 that has now been spent. And that's actually offset by a use of reserve, which we'll look at further down in this Appendix A. Just moving down onto the central schools block, some smaller underspends and an underspend in the admissions, which is mainly due to short-term vacancies. Just moving down onto the high needs block where we've got the significant overspend and the big forecast overspend at the moment on our additional resources of 1.5 million. That's our actual units of resource. When we set the budget this year, we increased that budget by only a couple of £100,000, and that was mainly to pick up pressure where we had out of borough placements. At the end of last year, we overspent on that budget by almost £700,000, but the feeling was that demand would start tailing off during 21-22. But what we've seen at the beginning of this financial year to date is that the demand for reviews and EHCP plans is still at quite a significantly high level. And although not all of those requests for reviews will actually result in a financial award, a significant of the number of them will. So at the moment, we're assuming that that level of demand and pressure is going to continue for the remainder of this financial year. We have a forecast underspend at the moment on the SEN top-ups of £96,000, and that's the top-up budget that goes hand in hand with those additional special places. So as we're not going to allocate all of those places for a full year, equally we won't use all of the top-ups that would set aside to go along with those places as well. A smaller overspend forecast on the independent schools, and also on the support for SEN at this moment in time. Because of that pressure at the moment on the units of resource in the high needs block, we are quite early on in the financial year, but it is an area that we are going to monitor closely and continue to report on. And again, because we won't be reporting back formally to Schools Forum until the September meeting, what we are proposing to do is that when the next High Needs Working Group meets, which will be before the September meeting, we will report back to that High Needs Working Group and give them an update on what the position is. So as I was saying, that's looking like at the minute we're going to have that forecast overspend of £1.1 million. So I think at this moment in time, what we're asking Schools Forum to do is to note the position and note that we will report back to the High Needs Working Group if they have a meeting before September, and also just to note that we will report that confirm that final underspend position for the early years by email once the grant's been confirmed. I'm happy to take any questions or comments from forum members.
Thank you, Christine. That is quite a difficult position for the high needs block. So I think it's absolutely urgent that we get a high needs working group together to have a look at that. Before I take your question, John, could I ask if there's been any progress made on the new SEN lead, because Tarun is no longer with us? Would I be able to get any feedback on that, because that would be crucial to setting up that high needs working group. James?
Yeah, the new head of SEND will be starting in September on the 1st. It's Katie Bird will be joining us on secondment for the next academic year. She's currently the head teacher at Lees Hill Primary School. Oh, excellent. So we can already begin to schedule that. I think we need to get that high needs working group, because we haven't had one for quite a long period of time. Could we get that in the diary for sometime early in September, James, do you think? Yeah, no, I'm happy to facilitate and support that as well, Adrian. Brilliant. Okay, thank you for that. John, your question.
Yeah, it's basically on the back of what you just said. It's that the
John, you cut out. Could you read
on the budget is due to the high need. And can you hear me?
John, your audio broke up. Can you try again? I'll turn my video off and see if that helps with bandwidth. Try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Basically, in a nutshell, in case it cuts out again, what are the local authority doing in order to develop a high needs strategy? Because the last 2 or 3 attempts have not achieved what they were set out to do.
Is that a question for James, perhaps?
Yeah, I think at last forum I did bring a note around the DSG management plan that's currently underway that Mark Williams has been brought in to look at, and part of that is to evaluate the spend on the high needs block. So we're hopeful that the outcome of that DSG management plan, with that focus on where we're spending on high needs, will give some recommendations to the way forward, and we should have that for forum meeting in September.
That would be a good thing, I think, to discuss at the high needs working group as well. That I think that's crucial. Pre-forum.
Thank you.
Is that okay, John? Yeah, excellent.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any more questions for Christine or anybody to our forum before we move on, so that we are then going to note this report and the financial forecast, and that we note the action in section 2 to communicate the 2021 final early years grant by email. Brilliant. Okay, Christine, thank you very much for that. No more. If we can move on then to the next agenda item, which is agenda item 8, which is just a review of the membership, which is Sue.
Right, so I'm Sue Ashley. You can see the report, yeah. This report identifies the number of reps and when their term of office finishes. So this first chart does that. So this identifies the type of reps and when their term of office finish. We currently have 2 academy vacancies due in August, due to finish at the end of August, and 1 in November, and 2 vacancies that have been vacant for a while. Letters requesting applications have been sent out, and there has been interest from outgoing reps to continue, but we have to go through the whole process of making sure that everybody eligible has an opportunity to apply. We have also had 1 application from another primary academy, and so it's certainly more promising than there has been in previous meetings when I've reported back. There's also a primary governor rep whose term of office is due to finish at the end of June, and I've also sent the letter out requesting applications for that as well. We have a number of new members since I last reported, which was the January meeting. So we have Moira Loftus, Jill Harris, and I've noted that Brian McGregor has started as a rep, but he doesn't actually start as the C of E rep until September. But he will be the new C of E diocese rep at that point. There are no changes to the primary and secondary academy split, which has to be, as per regulation, has to be based on pupil numbers. So from the January 21 census, the number of reps remain the same, even with the adjustment for Brackenwood Junior, who became an academy in January. And then the appendix just identifies the current reps and their full term of office. So that actually has names on it as well. That's any questions?
Thank you very much. Can I just apologise for those of you who are new to forum? I should have welcomed you at the start, and I neglected to do that. I do apologise. We will have to consider, I think, after this, Sue, in the rota, whether we're going to return to physical meetings at some stage in the new year, or whether we're going to have a balance and a blend of meetings. But thank you for illustrating that. If you could you move us straight on to that next item, which is the work plan, Sue, so we can just run through that.
Yeah. So I've set out the dates for the next meetings because we've struggled a little bit with the 2 meetings this year. We've actually moved into 1 meeting in the summer term rather than the 2. But we've left a provisional meeting in March just in case we need one. But I've put all the other dates are similar to the dates that we would normally meet. And I've added in a line for virtual / physical meetings. So probably suggest that the September 1 is a virtual meeting with a view to looking at maybe having a couple of, 2 meetings virtual and 2 meetings physical as we go forward.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult at the moment to predict what September is going to be like. So I think probably organising the September as a virtual one is wise, and we can make that work plan amendment going forward. If that seems sensible. Anybody, any thoughts on that? And going back to the other point, if you can go out to your colleagues and friends in the sector and convince them to be an academy or a school rep on the schools forum, you can remind them that it's an opportunity that will change their lives for the better. all are welcome. If we can get that message out so that we're not short and we can be properly represented, that would be great. Anything else? I'm conscious of the time. We might make kick-off after all. Anybody else? Any comments this evening? In which case, thank you all for attending this summer meeting, and I look forward to seeing you all in September. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sue, for that. Cheers. Good night, everybody.
Night.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Adrian.
Right, thank you.
Bye.
All good.